All right, so next up, we're going to take some of what we've learned around CSS to build a very simple photographer's homepage, portfolio site, something like that. It's, again, very, very simple. It's maybe 10, 15 lines of CSS and nothing crazy at all, but I think it looks half decent. In the real world, each one of these would probably be a little gallery you could click on to expand, right? This wouldn't be the entire website, just the homepage or a portion of it. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. There's a few things I need to explain. There is starter code for this video if you want to follow along. In the downloads folder for this particular video in the resources, you'll find the starter and solution code. And so the starter code just looks like this. It's a single HTML file, and it tells you put your name in there if you'd like instead of my name. And then also it comes with the images already added in because they're a huge pain to add yourself. You could copy and paste or, download these images. These are images that I did not take myself. There are 3 different photographers that I found. All of them are licensed for us to use, fortunately, and they're all conveniently black and white images. All right, so if you want to follow along, go ahead and open that up in your text editor, and then this is what you'll see if you open it in your browser. It's not as attractive. So we've got a couple of really just 2 things to tackle. First of all, the images and wrangling them into somewhat of a grid. And then second of all, the header up here, the little nav that has my name or your name or whatever that you decide, whatever the name of your site is. We need to figure that out second. But let's start with the images. So we need to just get them to be a standardized width to begin with. So I'm going to make a style sheet. I don't have that at the moment. So I'll make that. I'm going to work in the solution folder just so that, at the end, the completed code is in the solution. The starter is exactly the same, but I'm not going to touch it. So if you're confused why I'm working in solution, I'll call this photos.css. And then let's connect that, of course. So link photos.css. And then in there, I'm just going to select all images, and then I'll just give them a width. How about like 100 pixels to start? Hard code that width. Refresh, and there we are. Okay, so we've got our images somewhat under control. The next thing we're going to do is talk about how we would achieve this where we have 3 evenly or equally sized images going across, and then space divided between them evenly as well. And as I resize, you can see they scaled down. So they are not a hard-coded width like what we have at the moment over here. 100 pixels, these are always going to be 100 pixels. So instead, we're going to use another unit. We're going to use percentages. So why don't we do, 40%. Let's start there. We refresh, and this is what we see. 2 images per row, and they look to be about 40% each of that width. We've got, about 20% left over here. So that 40% is 40% of the body, of the parent element, and we get 2 of them side by side. Let's go with something, though, like 30%, and that should give us, 3 of them, plus a bit of space that we can then distribute, and you can see that space right there, right? If I give the body a border, I don't really need to, but you can just see, we've got this extra space, additional space, and I want to distribute that between these 3 images on each row. And now if I do resize, right, they do scale down. So that's the good news. It's pretty easy. But what's not as easy is figuring out how to space them out. So in a couple of sections, we're going to talk about Flexbox, and you'll see a much easier to use and just simple way that doesn't require mathematical calculations to add space between elements. Because the task in front of me is basically take whatever space this is. I don't know how many pixels, but take whatever that is and evenly distribute it across my elements or between them. And that's exactly what Flexbox helps us do. But we're not at Flexbox yet. So there is a way of accomplishing what I want to do. If we take that each one of these elements is 30% of that parent's width, that means we have 30 plus 30 plus 30, right? So that's 90% taken up, meaning I have 10% left. So if I want to distribute that space 10% around the images, I can use margin, right? We can just set a margin on each image just to begin with. If I do margin, how about 20 pixels? That's all 4 sides. I do have to comment that out. We do have some space, right? Okay, 20 there, 20, 20, 20, 20, and so on. And that's working. But I don't want to hard code that. because for one thing, that just doesn't respond to the size of the screen. Doesn't look great anyway, but it's not even, right? I have this extra chunk. So this is where we have to do some math. If we have 10%, we can divide that percent up into a smaller number, right? So this is 10%. How many places do I want to distribute it? Well, I've got this left side here, then I've got the right side of this image, and then I've got the left side of this image and the right side of that image. So that's 4, and then the left side and the right side. So that's 6. 6 total spots for margin, because remember, we add margin to the left and the right of an element. Theoretically, we could just do it, I don't know, on the left of this element and nothing on the right, on the left of this one, nothing on the right, but then we have to worry about this margin over here. So we're just going to add it to both sides, left and right. We'll also do top and bottom so we get this effect as well, but we're going to focus on the left and right for now. We need to take 10% and divide that by 6. So what does that give us? 10 divided by 6? Well, you can enter it into a calculator. The answer is 1.666666, so on, percent. So this is kind of obnoxious, to be honest, to have to type that out, to have to do that calculation. And then if you want to change things, let's say we wanted to, resize this to be 25% or 40% or whatever it is, we want more images in a row, then we have to recalculate that margin and do more math. But I'm going to refresh, and there we are. This is now evenly dividing that space between our elements. And you can tweak this, of course, come up with a different margin if you don't like how it looks. But you can see this does respond to the size of our window. The images shrink down because we used a percentage. If the body width changes, then the image width changes. And we use a percentage for the margin, so that changes as well. And this used to be very common to see all sorts of weird decimals and mathy looking numbers in our CSS layouts because we needed to do that math. We needed to figure out, if this thing is going to be, if there's 5 of these going across, or 3 or 7 or whatever, how much space do we put between them? We've got to divide, got to calculate, and then we have all these weird decimals in our style sheets. These days, there are easier options. We just haven't seen them yet. But I think it's important for you to see this because sometimes you'll still need to have a margin like this or, percentage-based width. There's nothing wrong with that. That's still very, very common. It's just more setting up that spacing between them is kind of janky. But as you'll see soon when we cover Flexbox, there are better options for spacing. Now, there's actually a better option. Instead of having to write 1.6666, there's an easier option where I can write something we have not seen at all. It's called calc, and it requires parentheses. And then I can pass in some mathematical thing for CSS to calculate, like this, 10% divided by 6. So this is just another option, but the reason I like to do this personally is that you can see the logic here, right? You can see, all right, we've got 10% that we're trying to split 6 ways. Instead of just 1.6666, that leaves a lot to you to figure out. But we end up with the exact same result, as you can see here. Alrighty, so that is our basic grid of images set up. It's not ideal. It's not, an amazing solution, but it's very simple. And it does use margin, right? And it uses width and percentages, and now this fancy new calc thing we haven't seen. I'll leave this original 1.666 in here so you can see it. And then next we're going to move on to just creating this header up top, which we'll use some Google Fonts, we'll use some margin and padding, and some of the other things we've seen so far. So that's coming up.